Hi, I'm Nancy with On Points Tutorials, Tips, and Tours. We're going to start talking a little more about machine quilting. With machine quilting, you have to have a start and a stop, a beginning and an end. And I want to take you through the tricky little thing I do with my thread to bring my bobbin thread to the top at the beginning and the end to make the back of my quilting be really nice and neat. So I've just got a little sample here, and I've got a dark thread in the top and a medium thread in the bobbin so that you should be able to see what I'm doing. I'm working with my walking foot. I'm going to do just straight line stitching to start, and I'm going to take my stitch length down to 0.3, 0.5, a very, very small stitch length. I'm going to now put my presser foot down. I'm going to roll my needle so it goes completely down and completely up. Lift my presser foot and bring my quilt to the side, and you can see my bobbin thread right there. It has pulled the bobbin thread up to the top. Now I can grab both of those threads, my bobbin thread and my top thread, put them under my foot, and I'm going to take about 5 or 6 stitches with that really tiny stitch length. Now I'm going to dial my machine up to the stitch length I want for quilting, which generally about 2.5. Take some stitching. Now let's pretend I'm at the end and I need to stop. So I need to do a locking stitch at the end. I'm going to dial back down to that 0.3, 0.5. Take 4 or 5 stitches. Now I'm going to lift my presser foot and bring the quilt forward. That's going to bring up a loop of the bobbin thread right here. So now when I hold this, I can just snip off the top thread and the bobbin thread at the same time. And on the back side, I've just got teeny little stitches at the beginning and teeny little stitches at the end. And no rat's tail, all my bobbins out of control in the bobbin. And then it also is going to be more secure. If you've ever done any stitching and you've made stitches that are too small and you realize you've made a mistake and you have to take those stitches out, good luck. It's impossible to get tiny stitches like that out. So now you can imagine how strong of a lock that is. Next, I'm going to show you the same technique, but with your free motion foot. Now I want to show you the start and the stop when you're doing free motion quilting. Remember, with free motion quilting, your machine has no stitch length. The stitch length is all up to you. So we're going to start by, again, bringing our bobbin thread to the top. So put my presser foot down, needle up, bring it forward, and there's my bobbin thread. So now I have my bobbin thread and my top thread. Go into position where I want to start. Now, when I start moving the quilt, I'm just going to move it really slow. So I get 5 or 6 really small stitches. Then I'm going to move in the motion I want to get a nice stitch length, whatever that may be. And then I'm going to end with those same little teeny tiny 5 or 6 stitches. So here's my tiny stitches. Then I go into a regular stitch length. And at my end, tiny stitches again. Now, to bring the thread to the top again, lift my presser foot, bring the quilt forward, put my thumb under the thread, take it back into position, do needle down, needle up, lift the presser foot again, and there's my bobbin thread. So I can just cut that right off. So cutting both of these, and I've got beautiful starts and stops on that quilt that are going to be very secure. The first quilting that you're probably going to try on your machine is straight line quilting in the ditch. And what in the ditch means is that you're trying to quilt between the 2 pieces of fabric. I think it's really important that you choose the right thread for that job. So I've made a couple of samples here, and on these samples I used 2 dark colors and a light color to kind of to give you an example of what I mean. So on a block like this, I've got red, white, and blue. Well, what thread color do I use? If I use the red to go in the ditch, which is right between the 2 fabrics, I can see my red thread. Now it's fine when it comes to this where it's between red and white. Well, the red thread is on the red fabric. But when it comes to this square where it's white and blue, my red thread is showing. Same idea with the blue. On the other side of this, I use the blue thread. Between the red and the white, I can see that blue thread. Well, where it's white and blue, I'm fine. The blue thread hides in the blue fabric. On the next sample, I use just white thread. Now, you would think that would be a safe choice, right? It's got white in it. Of course, white would be a safe choice. Well, it is a really good choice for this top line stitching here, but not really when it comes to in the ditch. When it's between the red and the white fabric, yep, the white thread hides beautifully. But what about here? When it's between the blue and the red fabric, you can see that white thread. Personally, I don't like that look. It drives me crazy. And what I figured out really early on, that the proper thread for in the ditch quilting is invisible thread. So the invisible thread is going to be a very, very fine filament that's going to be either of nylon or polyester. Honestly, I've never really noticed a difference between the type. Some people like nylon, some people like polyester. So be it. Find out which one you like best. But on this block, you can see the difference with the in the ditch quilting with invisible thread. So here is invisible thread between red and blue. It's invisible. You can't see it. Here it is invisible thread between red and white. You can't see it. That's the amazing thing about invisible thread. But I gotta tell you, invisible thread has a good thing, it's invisible. It has a bad thing. It's invisible. Trying to thread a needle with a thread that you can't see can be very difficult. The invisible thread can be a little bit stretchy, so sometimes it's going to break more often. You're going to have some tension issues. Once you work through those issues, invisible thread is going to be the thread of choice for your in the ditch stitching. I want to show you a couple of quilts that I've made recently and use them as an example for what I call equal density of quilting. So the first quilt here is a quilt I made for my son Keith, and it's a t-shirt quilt. You gotta love a t-shirt quilt. Where else are you gonna use all of those fabulous memories into something useful? You can only wear a t-shirt from high school for so long as an adult. So I took all of Keith's t-shirts and I cut them up and I put the interfacing on the back of them and I made them into the quilt. Love this quilt, but because a t-shirt quilt has this heavy printing on it here and here, you can't quilt through that. When you try quilting through this on most machines, you're going to break your threads. It's going to be a mess. So when I made this quilt, I knew this was going to happen, that the quilt would end up with this odd, what I call Jiffy Pop popcorn syndrome, because there's sections that I could not quilt, and then other sections that I didn't quilt too tight, but I quilted them, and so I've got these odd puffy things. That's okay. It's a t-shirt quilt. What's a t-shirt quilt for? It's for your lap when you're watching movies or you're going to go to a stadium with it. You're not going to hang it on a wall. So I'm okay that it's not flat. But because of the equal density of quilting, that's why it did that. This next quilt is a quilt I made for my husband. And on this quilt, I used an all-over quilting design. All of the design is about 1 inch apart over the entire quilt. So when I wash this quilt can hang on a wall. It's going to hang flat because it's got equal density of quilting. Well, it's time. We have worked a really long time on this quilt. All the pieces and parts have come together, and I am really ready to quilt the quilt. So I want to take you through the steps as I go. So I'm going to take you through just a little bit as I go. You're going to see how I maneuver the quilt and how I try to get the quilt inside this big section here on the machine and all the different designs that I do. I really want to show you all the different parts of quilting your Learn to Quilt quilt. So we already have done the stabilizing of the quilt on here. So here you see the line of stitching, and I did this line of stitching all the way around the entire quilt. So that has kept everything square that we worked so hard when we basted to keep it straight. That's going to help keep it straight. Then I came in and on each one of the borders, I did the same thing. So I did my line of stitching here. So I've got straight lines here, here, here. Throughout the quilt, I've done the straight lines. Then I've come to the middle of the quilt and continued those straight lines. So I'm going to go into this section here. So here is a long straight line. It's time to quilt that long straight line. So I've got my invisible thread in my machine. I've got my walking foot on my machine because I'm going to be doing straight lines. I get everything smoothed out. Oh, and you're working on a big table. The biggest table you possibly can get. You want to put your machine on the bottom right-hand corner so that your quilt can float all out on the rest of the table. Give yourself a lot of space. I'm going to start right here. This is a straight line that I have to quilt. I have my invisible thread in because I'm working in the ditch. When I come here, now with this machine, I don't have to do my starts and stops, pulling the bobbin thread up, because this machine has a really good thread cutter. So if you don't have a good thread cutter on your machine, you're going to bring your bobbin thread up so that it comes to the top to cut it off. With this machine, I don't have to do that. I'm really lucky. I'm going to start with a very small stitch, 5 or 6 stitches. Then I'm going to dial up to about a 2.5 stitch length, and it's time to quilt. I'm just going to keep continuing going straight, and you'll see that my hands are holding the quilt in place as I go. So my hands are really close to the foot, and I'm almost pulling the quilt away, and that kind of helps keep everything nice and flat while I'm quilting it. You need to stop the machine when you've come past your hands. You're never going to be with your hands out here while your machine is running. You're always quilting within the hoop that your hand makes. And on this machine, I have the ability to make the needle stay down. So every time I stop, the needle stays down. So if I've got to do some maneuvering around with the quilt, I don't need to worry about it moving. It's going to stay right where I left it. Now you will notice that sometimes, especially when you're doing with your walking foot and you're doing straight lines, there can be a tendency, no matter how much basting you've done, for the top layer to start to walk forward. And you will notice that when you come up on a portion of the quilt that's already been quilted. So I've quilted this section here, so it's stationary. As I come quilting to it, the fabric will want to bunch, so I'm going to put my hands even closer to where the needle is to hold the fabric in place, to not let it walk itself forward as I get to this little area. When I get to this area, it's time to turn. Whenever possible, you don't want to literally cut the threads all the time. You want to turn and make it one continuous quilting line if possible. So I've got to move the quilt. Shove this in here. Get everything nice and flat. I've turned it. I'm ready to go. Now I've already continued this long line, so I get to stop here. Going to dial down to almost 0 and cut my thread. Now I've got to go back and do that long line on the other side of the red. You'll see that there is no easy way to move the quilt around. Don't imagine that just because you get a machine with a bigger throat here that you're going to be able to easily move the quilt around. This is a big quilt. This is going to take a little bit of effort. So you need to put on a good movie and watch the movie, take your time, and relax. Now, I have been told by some that a glass of wine is also helpful. I'm not recommending that, I'm just saying it's an option. So I'm coming here to the next beginning, needle down, some small stitches. Oh, my thread came unthreaded, I need to thread it up again. The problem with invisible thread is it's invisible. So threading an invisible thread into this needle, not the easiest thing you'll ever do. Oh, I found it, yes. There it is. Can't believe I did that on camera. All right, now I'm going to take the little stitches, dial it up to my 2.5 and continue. Needle down. So I've changed my thread to a colored thread, and I've put on my free motion spring foot, and I'm ready to free motion quilt. What you are going to notice when I do the free motion quilting is with the straight line quilting, I had to muscle the quilt around to actually be doing the straight lines. With free motion quilting, you don't have to do that so much. So it's really the most important thing is the speed of the machine and the speed of your hands moving at a comfortable pace to keep the stitch length consistent. So I'm going to start here in this corner, and I've already thought about the design. I'm going to bop around the square and come in and do a swirl on the design and continue from there. I'm going to do the tiny stitches that I always do, but this time the tiny stitches are accomplished by just holding still, and then go. Pop over to this corner, and I'm going to move that thread out of the way and continue. Now I'm going to come into the middle of this block with a swirl, and then come back out on my swirl, back to the other side. Now I'm all done with that block. Never going to have to come back to it again. Now I'm going to start tackling the rail fence, and I'm just going to do a curved design up and down each one of the rails. When I get to the end, stop and go back up again. And keep in mind, because I've already done all that straight lines, the safety pins have come out. So I took out the safety pins in that area. Now I'm going to go back and forth on this next section. And it's just a matter of moving consistently. My machine is set up with a speed that I like, so I'm not even adjusting the speed on the machine. My foot pedal is all the way down. I'm letting the machine just run. This next design of quilting, I think I call it bopping around the block. I'm not really sure what to call it, but I love this type of design when I have a traditional block, and I wanted the quilting design to be sort of traditional, but not so straight lines, because that's just kind of boring. So this is all done free motion, and the idea is that I'm gonna go from one point a quarter of an inch into the little piece block, and then back to the point. But I'm going to do that in a continuous line throughout the block. It also is a fun kind of game to play to see if you can do the whole block without having to lift your needle. So that will be my plan. I usually start in a corner and I bop my way to the next section. And whenever I come to an intersection of seams, I do the bopping around that seam. So I hope it'll make sense as I'm doing it, and I'll try and talk through it. So I'm going to start here in the corner. I also am going to go a little bit slower with this. I'm not going to go quite as fast, so I'm going to dial my machine speed down a little bit. So I'm going to start here, come into the middle, about 1/4 of an inch into that piece block, and stop. What I like about this technique is you can stop at every intersection, so you can stop and plan it through. Okay, my next step is to go here and back again. And back. Now I'm to a long seam. So on this seam, I am going to S it. I'm going to come to the right and the left, and the right and the left. And then I'm going to go and S it back down the other side. So each one of these seams will end up being quilted on either side. Myself stuck a little bit. So now I go back down again on the opposite sides, crisscrossing at the intersection of that block. Now this is kind of tricky because I need to get this seam done right now. So I'm going to continue to S right through the pinwheel section of this block. To the other side. Now I'm going to come back down to the edge of the block. Now I've got these half square triangles. I'm going to do both of them at the same time. Go to my next section. Another long line, so this long line is going to be a continuous S-ing design. Now I'm going to start quilting on the flying geese section. Now I want you to notice I already did the straight lines on either side of the coping strip. So now I'm going to quilt onto the flying geese. And here I'm going to do that bopping stitch around the blue section and then come back and do some sort of a swirl in the flying goose. Not really quite sure what I'm doing. I'll figure it out when I get there, is usually how it works. All right. Now this is one of my favorite designs. This is a continuous feather, and on this design I'm going to go to the left side and then the right side and then the left side and then the right side all the way up this line. Now I know it's going to be hard for you to see when I'm quilting it, but I'm hoping we'll get a nice still shot afterwards so you can see it. So I'm going to start, and I also like when I'm doing something like this, I want to bring the quilt toward me instead of away from me. Then the quilt won't get stuck up on the table. There we go. So there's the left and to the right. And then when you come back to the left, try to go next to the line that you just stitched. You're not going to be on it, but try to stay next to it. Just a little bit away from it and bring the curve back. And just go left and right and left and right. As we were quilting the quilt, we were realizing that with all these beautiful busy fabrics, you probably weren't seeing the designs that I really wanted to show you. Keep in mind that's a good thing. When you're first doing your free motion quilting, having busier prints is going to hide any of the design errors that you might make. I hate to call them errors, just the design bobbles that you might make, maybe not the smoothest curved lines. So I love that for a beginner for free motion quilting, but I really want you to see the designs that I've done. So the next time we get together, I'm going to bring some solid fabrics and some nice bold threads and quilt for you the designs that I've quilted on fabric so you can really see.